Now, you might title this particular episode Balmoral Bombshells. Oh yes, it's that time of year when if you are the current British Prime Minister, like the Right Honourable Sir Keir Starmer currently is, although he's rated basically the worst Prime Minister virtually in the history of the job and polling incredibly badly, he's now got to, well, spend at least 2 days up at Balmoral alongside His Majesty the King and of course Queen Camilla. But what goes on behind the scenes of those infamous get-togethers? Let me explain. Good morning, nice to see you. Thank you as ever for your time today. We're by the beautiful side of the River Thames, and this is normally here, as you can see, the home of the current British government, the Houses of Parliament, and all that entails. Now, I want to tell you about how our current British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, is polling badly. He truly is. He's on a -16. Now, this annual sort of, should I say 16% down, yeah, terrible really when you think, and can't be exactly exciting news to go and visit, say, His Majesty the King and Queen Camilla, because normally you want to be on a high, have great news to tell people, that sort of stuff. But what a lot of people don't realise is when you get invited up to Balmoral by, of course, the reigning monarch of the time, it's a lot different than what is actually perceived. You see, it's long been said that the former British Prime Minister, the very first female British Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, absolutely detested her time at Balmoral, and it's fair to say after 11 years in the job she grew to like it. Originally she thought it was incredibly boring, dull and a complete waste of time. But according to folklore, our late and wonderful monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, managed to make sure that Margaret actually relaxed on future visits because she could sense that Margaret really was just a working machine. And the whole point of Balmoral is to be able to switch off. Now, as we all know, our late monarch, Queen Elizabeth, was very fond of her very first British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, and he had no problem switching off. He liked to go watercolour painting and all of the things that normally the royals do. So what can Sir Keir now expect in the modern day 21st century visit? Well, politics are literally off the table. Yes, now this may come as something of a surprise to some, because maybe after dinner, His Majesty the King and of course Sir Keir might retire to one of the many rooms in Balmoral, but normally it wouldn't really be a conversation, simply because, as we all know, His Majesty the King doesn't have to be and is not really allowed to be political in any form. Some people say that he does overstep the mark from time to time. Now, this is the reasoning behind this. It's supposed to be a release, a pressureless sort of period away for the British Prime Minister, not to be able to keep talking about politics. And this again, it goes back to Margaret Thatcher. The Queen realised that actually Margaret didn't have much conversation outside politics. It didn't matter what movie they came up with, what idea, game, conversation. Margaret seemed to be just stumped as to how this was going to play out. You see how this works. So if you wanted to know exactly what goes on in Balmoral, there are no bombshells, there's no royal family discussions. It's basically a getting to know you period, particularly with their very first time, as is Sir Keir and his wife Victoria making their very first trek up to the wonderful land that is Balmoral. Now, you're not allowed to talk about these personal visits. Yes, many do after their premiership in their autobiographies, but even then they have to be very guarded. According to one source, the former British Prime Minister Gordon Brown, well, he got on incredibly well with Queen Elizabeth, so much so that they carried on swapping Christmas gifts. That's a true sign of friendship. The similar thing happened with Winston Churchill and Margaret Thatcher. But not all Prime Ministers remain, shall we say, that close to the British monarchy once they've departed office. Jim Callaghan wasn't a particular favourite. A former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Denis Healey, another one, didn't particularly warm to the British monarchy, as one can imagine, and they didn't to them. So for all of those saying, well, what is he doing up there for 2 days? That's really the plot. It's a switch off, a conversation, getting to know you, and if there's any worries or fears that they have in the job moving forward. You have to remember that aside from our late and wonderful monarch Queen Elizabeth, King Charles has equally met as many great British Prime Ministers. And the other side of the coin is they've seen it all and lived through it all. And more importantly, if they've got any tweaky moments where they want to say, I'm not sure what to do about this, then they're very much in good hands, although discretion is key. Neil Sean in the very heart of London.